debate. I know there was to be a geographic focus today on Africa and on the Middle East. And I am going to violate that slightly, at least at the beginning, and partly in honor of Professor Bollino, because I'm going to start off with a focus on Italy, and in particular on Modena, Italy. Why would I do that? Well, as you can see here, I think that there is a key to understanding the world oil market that is found in Modena and nowhere else. How many people know Modena? I'm sure the professor does. So what is Modena known for? What could be, there are at least three treasures of Modena.
Ferrari. Ferrari. Okay.
Very good. Very well trained out there. And the third? Very good. Okay, you all deserve an A so far. Of course, there are many balsamic vinegars. This is one that's available in Texas, in my local market. I don't know where it ranks on the scale. I think fairly low. But even within the Delessi's balsamic vinegar, you can see there's product differentiation. Particularly the third bottle from the left is the one that we usually have at my house. And that's a balsamic vinegar that's aged 4 years in wooden barrels. So they store it and it takes on its special character. But if we have the dean coming over for dinner, I get the special bottle out, which is not even shown here. The market's too low. And it is a black label, and it's aged 20 years in the wooden barrel. 16 extra years. It starts out being the same vinegar, but it ascends to a higher level. Density, sweetness. Of course, it costs more as well. And the last time I went shopping in my market for these two, you can see that the 4-year-old was selling for $3.29 per bottle, versus the 20-year-old vinegar was $11.29 per bottle. Now, this poses an optimization problem. And in fact, it might even present a solution to an optimization problem, because clearly the opportunity cost of keeping the vinegar in the bottle, in the barrel, for 14 more years, 16 more years, is the opportunity cost of selling it now. In other words, the present value of the sales revenue in 16 years must equal the present value of the current sale, simply to avoid intertemporal arbitrage. And the managers of the inventory presumably keep this in mind. If they thought they could make more money by not keeping it in the barrel for 16 years, we wouldn't have that barrel of vinegar, aged vinegar, on the market. So you can see the arbitrage condition. I just call it the seller's indifference condition, but it says the 329 must be equal to the present value over 16 years of the future sale. And if we're willing to believe that 8% is the appropriate risk-adjusted discount rate for Alessi vinegar, then it looks like they're doing a pretty good job of optimization, because we have a perfect satisfaction of the seller's indifference condition, that they are keeping just enough inventory, and it's going to be just valuable enough to justify keeping it off of the market. This is the key, I contend, for understanding OPEC's recent and even previous behaviors. Because all we have to do is to change the vinegar into crude oil. We have to understand that the Saudis, at least up until recently, had the prospect of selling a barrel of crude oil today, or as it says here in the year 2010, for $80. But they have so many proved reserves, they're still going to be selling oil 40 years hence. For how much? Well, the seller's indifference principle would say they better be getting $1,634 for that barrel that is going to be held in inventory in the ground over that period of time. That's assuming that an 8% discount rate again is relevant to the Saudis. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's 5%. Maybe it's 10%. It doesn't matter. It says that the value of the oil in the ground must appreciate at the rate of interest to reward you for not selling it today. Very simple economic principle, clearly one that the Saudis are aware of. And you can see here that it would take $1,600 oil by the year 2050 to justify to the Saudis keeping those reserves, those long-life reserves, rather than accelerating development and extraction, marketing them today. So what do I make of this? I make of this first that it's fun to have high prices in the short run. I've had a discussion with a number of people from Saudi Arabia, people from Aramco, pointing out that maybe the price, if it stays at $100 a barrel, could discourage demand, and it could encourage competing rival supplies. That is, it could destroy the residual demand for Saudi oil, but not in the short run, because of the rigidities, because of the inelasticity of short-term demand, and the lead time to prepare or to discover alternative technologies. So in the short run, very high prices have mostly favorable impacts on the decision maker. And the short run might dominate in policy making, but in the long run, we see the negative impacts. And that's where the feedback of sustained high prices does destroy demand for, residual demand for OPEC oil, and more pointedly for Saudi Arabian oil. And I hardly have to repeat the oft-quoted phrase about the coal age. The Saudis are well aware that the oil age will not end because they have run out of oil. And now we understand the new meaning of peak oil as being peak demand, perhaps, rather than peak supply. All of this is simply to put into perspective the fact that the Saudis need to monetize an asset, and they don't have forever to do it. To be able to monetize it, to be able to sell it at all, it has to be priced at a competitive level. And if they're concerned about the present value of their revenue stream as they monetize it, they have to be thinking about current price versus future price. Are the two in balance, are likely to be. If OPEC doesn't expect prices to reach $1,500 a barrel in the next 40 years, then they need to accelerate production and exploitation of the resource base. To do that, of course, OPEC has to accept a lower price now to stimulate demand, to discourage competing supplies. They also would have to expand by investing in new capacity to accelerate the delivery of oil to the market. And I'm always reminded at this point when we're talking about accepting a lower price of what my old professor Maury Edelman used to say in class, and that's OPEC's job. It's just like singing and mountain climbing. It's a lot easier going up than when you're coming down. And OPEC has, I think, learned that lesson a number of times. Right now, they're in the coming down phase. They're descending from the mountain. It's not going to be an easy ride. But I think that it points to the fact, given the longer-term perspective and finally the arrival of competing supplies, be that shale oil or be that demand reduction through conservation efforts, I would not advise long-term investors to take positions that require $70 oil over the next decade or so. I think we have reached a new era, and it's because structural changes have swept the market, both on the supply side and the demand side, and with a full realization on the part of OPEC, particularly Saudi Arabia, that the world has changed and their optimal price has probably changed. I'm going to point to some research that I did 9 years ago, and I apologize to Monet because I think I first presented this at the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank in 2006. But it was an exploration using a model that I built, a model of the world oil market, supply, demand, different regions, to examine the destruction of demand for OPEC and for Saudi oil that would come through sustained high prices. And that's to say that the model included an innovation, technical innovation component, where sustained high prices would trigger a Poisson probability each year, that there would be a technical advance that would destroy some demand. The higher the price is, the greater the probability that that would happen. The longer the price stays high, the greater the probability that would happen. Of course, I had to calibrate the model as I thought were some suitable parameters using the state of the world oil market back in 2006. And I was quite happy that the parameters seemed reasonable at the time. They seem even more reasonable in retrospect. You see, what it pointed to was that if we looked over a 50-year horizon at OPEC production, equaling the difference between total global demand and rest of world supply, the amount of demand for OPEC brought back to present value had a maximum value, that is maximizing the wealth of OPEC, if the price were held at about $60 a barrel long term. This is looking at total OPEC wealth, all the member countries combined. And you can see that there's a sharp drop-off at lower price levels, so that OPEC has quite a strong incentive to keep price at something close to this type of level. That is, if they're interested in wealth maximizing. But OPEC is heterogeneous, of course, and if you looked at who would be favoring high prices, I broke that revenue stream and the wealth component into the three sections: Saudi Arabia, the other core, which is essentially Kuwait and UAE, that's the red line, and then the fringe, all the other OPEC members. And clearly the fringe, because they lack the discipline to curtail their own production, favor the high price. And that's because the Saudis traditionally bear the brunt of those, of defending the high price. But even for those members, $60 a barrel, long-term, over a 50-year horizon, would be an appropriate price for them to exploit, monetize, and deplete their resources. Saudis have many more resources than that and lower costs. So for them, the equation, the trade-off is quite different. And you can see at that point we were looking at $40 per barrel. It's very imprecise, but it's just suggestive of the fact that these low prices were motivated almost strictly by the danger that their high prices would trigger demand destruction. They had. That brings us to the idea of shale oil. The U.S. shale revolution has remade world trade in oil, as perhaps some of our African friends are able to testify today. Some people have interpreted this change as being the shale oil replacing OPEC as the swing producer, or replacing Saudi Arabia as the swing producer. We know that a swing producer is a stabilizer, varies production to try to maintain more or less a stable price level. A few weeks ago, Petroleum Intelligence Weekly picked this up and resoundingly said, yeah, it sounds good, but it's not true. Shale oil is not the swing producer because, first, there's no spare capacity to be manipulated or exploited when it might be needed. And second, because there's no central command or brain that's thinking about the price in terms of defending a level or picking a level. So I go along with that, but I think if you pursue economic theory, the threads of stabilization at least, if that's what we mean by swing producer, maybe shale oil is a bit of a swing producer, because even though there's no spare capacity to offset shocks when they arise, it's still true that if there's a demand shock pushing up the price, then shale supply is going to rise also, and that's going to mitigate the price increase. It's going to limit it. And vice versa. If there's a downward pressure on price, then shale diminishes to try to stabilize the price. It's not a witting, purposeful reaction as a swing producer, but it's in the same direction. And in fact, if the supply of shale were perfectly elastic, which is to say if there were a lot of shale and it all cost the same amount, let's say $60, then you would have a perfectly elastic supply from this swing producer. You can see that the supply curve is horizontal at $60. No matter what happens to demand, it's a perfect stabilizer. Shale expands or declines to maintain the price. Now, this assumes that it's perfectly elastic, which it's not, but it's just to emphasize this point that there is an important component of the swing producer here. But it's with a difference, and I'm very close to finishing my piece now, but I think it's important to realize that stability is provided by that elasticity of supply, but the price point around which the stability is attached is still going to be determined by OPEC. They're feeding oil into the market. We saw the difference their decision makes back last November, when it was suddenly apparent to the market that the Saudis were not going to be reducing production, they were going to be defending a new lower price, and that required maintaining production. So it's not the same swing producer. It doesn't displace OPEC. It, in some sense, makes OPEC's job maybe a little more difficult, or at least puts it into a different pricing point. But there's also a difference in that shale supply response is not going to be perfectly synchronized with shocks and developments that would destabilize the price. Partly that's just because of the lead time it takes to drill and frack, complete a well, start with getting permitting going on that. So there's going to be a delay. And partly, if the price would fall, as we've seen for the last year now, most of these shale oil producers are using financial hedges. And the majority of shale oil production in the U.S. is hedged at a fixed price of about $85 to $90 for the rest of this year, and some going into 2016. Which is partly why we've seen sustained production levels, at least in the short term. So there's going to be some lack of synchronization from the swing producer. It's mainly putting pressure on OPEC to rethink what is the long-term appropriate price that's going to allow these resource-rich countries to maximize their resource wealth, or at least to move it in the direction of maximizing it. And then finally, unlike my picture, the supply of shale oil is not perfectly elastic, so it's not a perfect stabilizer by any means. This comes up in a lot of guises. The media lately has been asking the question, what price is it going to take to shut down the shale and put OPEC back in control? And there is no such price. The question doesn't really make sense because shale is heterogeneous. Some shale was already dead when we were back at $100 per barrel. There are a lot of shale leases not developed, some of them not even taken, because they're not economic. The well productivity is too low. And then there are sweet spots where the productivity justifies. And, the Saudi oil minister, Naimi, recognized this and said at the time, back in November, that some of the shale would still be there at $30 per barrel, with which I agree. IHS put out a study a few months ago, again pointing to the heterogeneity and saying that some of the oil is going to be lost to low prices, but about 80% of it that would have been coming on stream this year would still remain on stream as long as the price stayed at $70 or above. So this gives us the idea that there's an elasticity of supply. There's a sensitivity that the shale deposits are heterogeneous. How much so? I'm just going to close with some personal estimates that are the result of some formal research that I've conducted this spring and some informal class projects I've had my students do. These are the two most active shale oil basins in the U.S. The Eagle Ford Shale is in Texas on the Gulf Coast. You can see that the estimates of the technically recoverable shale oil volume, that's not the total in place, but that's the technically recoverable, would be about 3 billion barrels. Not all of that is economically recoverable. And so the job here is to estimate what is a break-even price given the distribution of well productivities. The U.S. Geological Survey has studies showing that the well productivities follow something very close to a log normal distribution. Very wide disparities between the sweet spots and the off shoulders. So I find that about 60% of the Eagle Ford is still economic at $70, 30% still economic at $40, 10% still economic at $20. So I would agree with Oil Minister Ali Naimi that it is a question of the price level, but there's no one price that's going to kill shale. You can see the same is true in the Bakken, which is the North Dakota larger shale oil basin. There we have 36 billion barrels of recoverable reserves. This is a little higher cost basin. The wells are a little deeper, and it's a little farther from infrastructure, and so $90 is required to make 60% of that resource economic. $50 though gets a lot of oil. We're at $50 now and above. Even at $25, we're still getting a volume of oil, which is greater than all of the recoverable oil in the Eagle Ford Basin. So there's differences between the basins, there's differences within the basins. We have to think about the stabilization being subject to the fact that the price, the cost runs up and the cost runs down when production is increased or when the development intensity declines. Clearly, OPEC needs to think about that also as it's deciding whether or not it should step back into defense. $60, $70, $50. I don't know the answer to that, but I thank you for your attention today.
So, I will immediately call Professor to speak about the Middle East. Let's see if there is a
Well, that's a tall order to speak about the Middle East, but some aspects of the Middle East. Well, thanks a lot for your invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here. What I intend to do today is to provide you with a different perspective of this very insightful presentation by Professor Smith. I'll focus more indeed about the Middle East and try to have a rather more, if you want, deep focus on some of the dynamics that impact the geopolitics of the region and particularly, of course, the oil aspect of it. And here I have essentially three sub-themes that I want to share with you. These are, to me, the short-term and medium-term developments that will affect the situation of the region as far as energy and oil is concerned. One is Iran, the other one is Iraq, the future of Iraq, and also thirdly, a state which obviously is not in the Middle East, but as we've seen, will very much impact the foreign policy angle of all of this, is the US. So let me start with Iran. Why is Iran important? Iran is important not only because it's certainly a very influential regional country, but beyond that, it's one of the major players in the oil business. And also the fact that currently Iran is under a set of embargoes, a set of sanctions, which does limit its potential to participate in the production and also the export side of the oil business. So there is an expectation among analysts that if the currently negotiated nuclear deal is concluded, Iran will come back to the forefront of the oil market, and statements by Iranian officials indicate that there might be, even in the short term, at least an aspiration to add about 500,000 barrels a day of additional output to the market. Now, the question is, how likely is that? Are we going to see Iran coming back to this marketplace as an unimpeded player? So a few words about, and this obviously will very much hinge on whether the nuclear deal will be a success or not. As I suppose some of you have been following, the negotiations dragged on for a very long number of years, with allegations that Iran was having a concealed nuclear weapons program. But eventually, first of all, a temporary agreement was concluded, which then has led to a more detailed agreement with a final deadline for the end of this month, actually, for the permanent agreement. Now, the agreement that emerged is actually, when you look at the details of the agreement, I think it's quite a well-articulated, well-designed, and surprisingly good agreement. It's very detailed in terms of how it closes the potential loopholes to an Iranian nuclear weapons program, but it also allows Iran what it had aspired to, namely a domestic possibility for uranium enrichment. So both sides will be leaving the negotiation table with something that, to take back to their home constituencies. And obviously this is very important because the deal is not finalized yet. There are a number of threats to the deal. Of course, on the Iranian side, you have the more hawkish elements, the more conservative parts of the Iranian polity, including the Republican Guard. And in the US, you have Congress, where also also because of Israel and its position on this issue, there's quite a bit of pressure on the US Congress to torpedo the deal. My feeling is that nonetheless the deal will be salvaged and we shall see. However, there are still a number of vulnerabilities in that deal which I just want to share with you very shortly. The first one is the issue of sanctions. Sanctions relief, which will ultimately impact on how soon, how big Iran will come back to the game of oil production and export, where we see two different interpretations, which is a vulnerability of the deal. For the US and for the countries that have negotiated the deal, the P5+1 as it's called, there will be sanctions relief. However, at the end of the process, where Iran has not only signed the agreement, but also has implemented some of the major aspects of the agreement. So from that perspective, we're looking actually at an additional perhaps 12 months before Iran becomes a more major player, which will be the period after June 2015, when Iran will be expected to comply with some of the requirements of this agreement. The expectation on the Iranian side is, however, different. Tehran wants these sanctions to be lifted as soon as there is a deal. So I think this is one point of tension that will need to be managed if there is indeed going to be a deal. The second one is between actually the US and the remaining P5+1, namely how the US wants to structure the lifting of sanctions with a degree of automaticity. What that means is that the US is actually talking about the suspension of the sanctions, whereas the Iranians are talking about an end to the sanctions regime. The difference is that the US wants to be in a position that if at some future time Iran happens to violate some of its commitments under this deal, then the sanctions will snap back automatically. There won't be any need for another UN Security Council resolution, which potentially could be blocked by Russia or China, and therefore the US does not want to face that possibility of having seen the sanctions being eliminated and not be able to impose them back. So that's one big question mark out there about how the international community will actually manage the lifting of sanctions to Iran, which will have an impact on how soon Iran will come back to the market as a major player. There are other vulnerabilities in the deal. One is in relation to Iran's past military activities. That has not been fully addressed yet. There is an expectation on the side of the international community that Iran should come clean about what it has done in the past, and Iran so far has resisted these demands. But nonetheless, I think the deal that has been signed, the temporary deal, the action plan, is indeed a very detailed one, and we shall certainly see in a month's time a bit more that a final deal will emerge. So when you look at the geopolitics of the situation in the Middle East, and particularly oil, that I think is one fundamental, very important dynamic that has the potential to shift the politics of the region and also on the side of the energy. Now, what I try to share with you some of the optimistic assessments of about around this deal, but there are also some criticism, especially when you hear both Saudi Arabia, Israel, that have severely criticized the deal, essentially because they believe that Iran will not play by the rules of the game, that they will use this deal and use the sanctions relief, the mainstreaming of their economy in world markets, the rise in their oil production to essentially boost both their economy, but also become more assertive on the foreign policy side and still continue with some sort of concealed nuclear weapons development. And therefore, that sort of claim is certainly something that we see being opined quite clearly. Netanyahu was was in DC, he spoke to the US Congress, and he basically made this argument that you can't, that Iran will not be faithful, that it's not giving Iran the right to domestic enrichment one way or another would lead to nuclear proliferation in the region. So you also have those people who claim that there are aspects of this deal that may not necessarily be conducive to the type of scenario that I've tried to outline. Now, the second dynamic in the region, which I think is important to take into consideration, is Iraq and the future of that country, in particular with regard to oil, because at least viewed from Ankara, there certainly has been in the last few years a number of agreements to boost the oil production and the exports of the northern Kurdish region of Iraq, where the regime is indeed intent on becoming a more major player, boosting both production and also exports to world markets through Turkey. However, with the caveat that this more ad hoc arrangement has been challenged. It has been challenged essentially by the central authorities in Baghdad, claiming that this export of KRG oil, the Kurdish region government in Iraq, is unconstitutional. So the next phase of this will be to see whether there can actually be an agreement between the central authorities in Iraq and the Kurdish regional government about how to share the oil and gas resources of the country. Constitutionally, there are some arrangements whereby it is said that the natural resources of the country belongs to the people of Iraq, but that there will be a shared distribution, a revenue sharing scheme, where 17% of that will go to the KRG and the rest to the federal government. However, that arrangement has been very problematic to implement with accumulated arrears from Baghdad, with a stop and go on the side of oil production and oil exports from the KRG, and at the bottom of which now there is a very big deficit of trust. And the question is whether under any circumstances that deficit of trust can be bridged, whether we will see in Iraq that will return to the fundamentals, to the qualities of being a sovereign state with the ability to enforce and implement its different sets of legislation, or whether we're looking at a different scenario where also because of the rise of radicalism in this region, this is not the panel to talk about the emergence of the Islamic State, but nonetheless this is one of the factors that is actually driving policy and thinking about the future of that country. So whether Iraq will be able to remain as a single entity, or whether in years to come we shall see a different sort of political geography emerging there, with possibly an independence for the Kurdish side, will also have a big impact on the energy policies and on the oil production situation in the region. So right now, the fact that, perhaps paradoxically, the emergence of the Islamic State and the threat that it poses both for Baghdad, but also for the Kurds and for many actors in the region, has really led to an alliance against the Islamic State. And therefore these aspirations, if we can talk about aspirations of independence on the side of the Kurdish regional leadership, has been pushed back essentially because of the security nightmare that the Islamic State represents. Barzani was in Washington a month ago, and there he also talked about these aspirations, but the message that we received from US policymakers was that we don't want to address this. There's already quite a nightmare scenario unfolding in the region, so we don't want to deal with this situation as it stands. But in order to look at how that's going to impact oil, well, there is certainly a number of very ambitious programs and goals that have been set out by the KRG government, by its oil minister. But whether these will come to pass, it will greatly depend on whether there can be an agreement between the KRG authorities and Baghdad, or in the absence of an agreement, where we shall see a scenario of disintegration, which may further fuel instability. The final factor that, at least for today, I want to share with you is to complement what Professor Smith has been saying, and look more at the political aspects of what that all means in terms of the US becoming a much more influential, visible player in oil production and possibly oil exports. We have seen the impact, the price impact, but I'll share with you also, the quantity impact by figures. I look back about 5 years, so because the real impact of non-conventional oil has started to appear around 2009. So the 2009 figure was about 5.3 billion barrels a day of production in the US. Now it's up to 7.4 billion barrels a day. So we see an increase of about 39%. Of course, some of that will be impacted by the lowering of the oil price. But nonetheless, when we look at how the US fares, back in 2009, with that figure, it was about the same as Iran and a bit less than Iran and Kuwait combined in terms of its production. Now it's certainly more than that. It's the production of the US has surpassed both Iran and Kuwait together, and also possibly reaching the one of Iraq as well, all combined. Of course, Saudi Arabia is much higher, with about 9.7 billion barrels a day. The US, as a result, has also become a more important player in terms of oil exports, although there are legal impediments to US oil exports, as you all know, I suppose, and that is under current challenge. The current trade agreement, the mega-regional trade agreement between the US and the EU, called TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. The Europeans are asking for an energy component to that, so that this restriction on the US side to exports of primary energy could be lifted. But nonetheless, the outcome of these developments is essentially, or at least we're questioning whether this is going to lead to a change in US foreign policy in relation to the Middle East. There is an argument that the oil component, which in the past has been so influential in determining US foreign policy choices, will be impacted by the US becoming more independent, possibly by becoming an exporting country rather than an importing country. And this will certainly have a bearing on how the US looks at the Middle East. There are also other claims which essentially point to the role of Israel, and as long as the relationship between US and Israel remains as is, US foreign policy will not be very much affected, regardless of what happens on the oil side. So that, to me, remains an open question, but nonetheless, when we look at all these three fundamental drivers of what I see under this general theme of the geopolitics of oil in the Middle East, these are all areas where Iran, Iraq, and also the US position is certainly very likely to affect, either individually or as a combination thereof, the geopolitics of oil. So, thank you.
Wonderful. So, then I will invite Ruby Ledari as a third speaker for today.
you very much. Let me apologize for Dr. Okon, who could not be here because of the changing dynamics in politics. We just had an election, and the party that has been governing Nigeria for the past 16 years was defeated, and a new government came in, and being the chief strategist for the national oil company, he couldn't be here. So I apologize on his behalf. I'm not going to say I can fill his shoes, but I have to quickly put these thoughts together to be able to make sure that there's no vacuum with respect to Africa. So what I'm going to talk about is to look at the geopolitics of global petroleum supply and pricing, and how relevant is Africa. And I'm going to borrow from what Dr. Atley said yesterday, that geology plus economics equals economics of oil. Geology taken out then becomes geopolitics. So I want to look at this aspect from an engineering point of view and make some conclusion based on the data I'm going to show you, whether Africa is going to be relevant or not. So basically, I'll quickly look at the state of the global oil reserves, I'll look at the role of Africa, and look at growth in Africa with respect to reserves. I'll also look at the outlook from reserve growth, the capacity expansion in Africa, and the industry performance. Here, I'll try to look at, you cannot really isolate Africa if you look at the structure of the industry in most of the African countries. So even when we talk about geopolitics of Africa, from African perspective, we need to look at the key players. So I'll try to look at what are the major determinants in Africa with respect to how they can continue to influence the global oil and gas supply. And I'll try to portray the role of the key players. Bearing in mind that Africa is divided because you have the oil and gas industry is made up of merely all the colonial masters. And of course, we always look home, even as we look at the industry in Africa. So, what I discussed the issues on the fiscal limit of petroleum availability from Africa. I will analyze the industry performance indicators, and I will evaluate how the global key players do influence petroleum supply through Africa. And I will demonstrate the extent to which the role of Africa in sustaining oil and gas era is limited. And then quickly just looking at this, we assume we have about 3.5 to 4 billion estimated conventional oil. About 9% of it is currently located in Africa. And look at the estimated reserves in Africa compared to other parts of the world. You could see Africa holds about estimated proved reserves as of first of the year in 2014. Perhaps it must be, one must quickly add that reserves could be classified into two basic categories in the geological setting. You have what you call proved reserves and you have what you call unproved reserves. When you talk about proved reserves, which is normally reported and accepted by the Securities and Exchange Commission in New York, you are thinking in terms of looking at current technology, looking at current economic conditions. There's a 90% certainty that you're going to get nothing less than what you estimated that you're going to produce. This is completely different from what we call unproved reserves, which you can break into two. Either it is a probable reserve, in that case it is more likely than not that you're going to get what you estimated you're going to get, or possible reserve, which is 10% less likely than not that you're going to get what you said. So if you put that in perspective, you can expect that the probable reserve is bigger in size than possible reserve, and then than proved reserve, and your possible reserve is bigger than your probable. So that's where we come with what we call the 1P, the 2P, and the 3P. For Securities and Exchange Commission, any company who is traded in the United States can only report what we call the proved reserve, and that's the basis of some of the things we are going to be talking about. And you can see the role of Africa with respect to world production profile. Africa is one that is tiny there, which I think is probably base according to the symbol. And so you could see that basically it has remained almost flat over the period. Oh, sorry, Africa is blue. This one there, I'm not colorblind. And so they literally remain blue. And it's very interesting when you talk about geopolitics of oil and its impact on pricing. You can see the movement of oil from Africa. I mean, this is at the end of 2013. You could see that 820 million barrels per day to North America was probably the least go back into history. If you look at Nigeria, 33% of oil produced in Nigeria used to be exported to the United States. Today it's probably just about 1%. So you could see what's going to happen even as Congress continue to move over whether they are going to open oil production in the US for export. In that case, Nigeria, Angola, and some other parts of African producers will have to be competing for the European market, which you see now is very, very big. It appears as the US move away from taking oil, particularly from Nigeria. Nigeria seems to be going to Europe and Asia. And then if the export in the United States is now open, then you expect a situation in which something has to happen if Africa wants to continue to have influence on global oil situation. And some of the important things you can look at is supposed to be reserves, is to look at African countries within OPEC. Most of the influence that African countries have today is through their membership of OPEC, which I think, looking at the forecast by Dr. Smith, Africa producers are probably free producers, and you can see Nigeria, for example, has only 3% of OPEC proved reserve. Angola has near 1%, and Nigeria have near 1%. So they are really what we call competitive fringe within OPEC. I think even though they may have small reserve, politically speaking, they have great influence. Because if you go back to history in OPEC, one of the most influential OPEC member person was Lukman, who was president for many years and was actually Secretary General for many years. So the presence of these countries in OPEC has great implication even for the future. No, I like to look at what's going on in Africa to not write them off, because Africa is very optimistic with respect to the resources that are still available to be developed. If you look at 1975, there are only a few countries involved in oil and gas production in Africa. Fast forward and look at 2015, nearly the entire African continent is available for exploration. And if you look at even the technology that were used to discover these resources in Africa, they are not as up to date compared to what you have in other parts of the world. So by 2025, we don't know whether the entire African countries will be filled up. Certainly, these are some of the optimistic school of thought that one can project from some of this evidence. I expect that the recoverable reserves in Africa will continue to grow. The size of the growth may be a little bit difficult to predict or imprecise at this particular time because of lack of adequate technology to be able to do that. More countries are currently engaged than ever before, maybe many more, if the price of oil continues to attract investment, and if we continue to have good, effective, and efficient fiscal system, we will continue to attract some investment. Technology also that we have today, which is available to Africans, not only enhances the ability to expand production, it actually makes it possible to be able to locate reserves or resources where you really did not think that you are going to be able to do that. So the fiscal policies that most African countries are debating is expected to attract investment to Africa, and then big players are present in Africa. You have Shell, you have Total, you have BP, or now you don't have BP anymore. You have some of these big companies who are really willing and waiting for political stability. And interestingly, especially when you look at what implication will be in the future with respect to African role, is the indigenous participant. Perhaps most of you may not even know that this shale revolution that we are actually just talking about did not come not as a result of big players. There are independent producers in the US that were actually the brain behind this shale revolution. So I believe as the industry expands and allow indigenous participation in Africa, Africa will probably become more and more important in the scheme of things as time goes on. I usually like to look at the way in which the continents attempt to replace reserves. It's just like you having an income, and then you have savings, and then you are able to put much more money in your savings account that you are taking out of your savings account. And if God gives you long life, that means you're going to be able to maintain your quality of life for a very long time. So if you look at inventory of reserves from this point of view, then you see the ability of countries to be able to sustain the ability to continue to be key players in the oil and gas industry. And of course, Africa is not doing badly. If you look at the blue, they're replacing more than 100% of the extraction rate. And that's what we want to see if a particular section of the oil and gas sector will remain in business for a long time. Now, when you go back and look at the African countries within OPEC, and then try to compare what they are doing with respect to replacing their reserves, then you will see that the more they are able to grow their reserves, the more influential they are going to be able to be in the debate on how OPEC influences the dynamics of the global oil and gas market. I mean, I think if not because of the war in Libya, Libya has always been able to grow their reserves substantially. So you see Angola, Algeria, and Nigeria, they are replacing more than 100% of their reserve, which is encouraging. Now, if you look at what we call the reserves life, how long are you able to sustain your current productions? The African countries are not doing badly as well. If you look at 1998, they are able to sustain current production by about 27.8 years. Now, fast forward, come to 2013, they are able to sustain about 53 years of current extraction rate. Now, this should not be misinterpreted to mean that oil will last till 53 years. But saying that if you are not adding anything to what you have now, you can continue to produce at the current rate for the next 50 years. Bearing in mind that even as technology improves, you are even able to expand your recoverable reserve. Again, you have another type of, you can compare then African countries with other continents of the world, and you can see that they are not doing badly. On average, the OPEC reserve life is about 90.3 years at current consumption rate. The global is about 53.3, and then you have Africa is 40.5, and the African OPEC countries members about 55.3. So they are not doing badly with respect to being in this business. There are caveats with respect to the ability to continue to have this type of influence. And it begins with what I call economic fundamentals. The first is the low supply responsiveness. Currently, it's very difficult for Africans to be able to respond quickly to expand their capacity, either as a result of what I call ineffective policy, and secondly, institutional weaknesses. I'm surprised that some countries that have been in oil and gas business for many years would not come together and pass a bill that will create fiscal incentive, and it's taken them over 10 years. So some of those things have big implications on whether they are going to be able to respond in the future. Spare capacity is also an issue. There's also the likelihood that in the nearest future, the economy of Nigeria, which is the biggest in this African scenario, will expand. Usually it is what I say. If you look at Nigeria, there are about 170 million. If you look at the United States, there are about 320 million. And the US is consuming about 18 to 20 million barrels per day. Nigeria is consuming less than 1 million barrels per day, which is ludicrous. So suppose there's a turnaround, and in that case, they are now able to find better use for their oil consumption. Of course, that will change a lot of things as we approach the future. Access to petroleum resources, the bidding process in some African countries still leave much to be desired. I believe even as time goes on and we begin to get grab of doing things the right way, that some of these things will play a big role in the future. Certainly there's going to be the tendency for Africans to begin to look inward and invest inward, and if there's no better place to invest your hand resources than Africa, where you can easily develop resources. Of course, technological innovations. Now, the players who are currently looking at developing oil and gas resources in Africa really have a role with respect to how Africa will play in the future with respect to the dynamics of global oil and gas supply. And what I usually say is that the companies operating in Africa are going to be more long-run driven than go in there, exploit and go. To be able to do that, then African countries must become more stable in their fiscal systems and fiscal terms. Because what the companies are looking at is, where can I put my money and get it quickly, so as to be able to minimize my risk exposure. I mean, restructuring moves to promote efficiency, which is keeping perspective, equity, effectiveness, and what I call ethical issues. But these are some of the things that African countries will have continued to improve upon if they want to continue to be big players. And the international companies who are becoming more and more aware of the importance of doing what I call corporate social responsibility. And the more they are able to embrace that, the more one can guarantee the support of the communities who have to be able to sustain production and then increase the relevance of Africa within the context of the growing oil and gas restructuring picture. Yeah, there are limited direct E&P investment to Africa, and I've tried to say that. You wonder at times that maybe if the country is fortunate, because look at the investment flow for E&P activities. Africa tends to attract more investment from foreign investors next to the United States. And again, of course, this is because you have so many companies from the United States that are involved in oil and gas production. Perhaps when African countries become more stable in the political way, and the investors begin to realize what I consider a stable governance structure, that instead of sending money to the more expensive places to explore for oil and gas, that because it is a little bit cost effective there, and they are not necessarily nationalistic, if I can use the word, there's no resource nationalism that in effect in most African countries, then maybe they'll be able to get more investment into African countries to be able to develop these resources. Of course, you cannot isolate Africa, like I said. You have to keep in focus what is going on around it. Take, for example, diversification of supply sources in the EU and the United States can have big impact. The energy policy objectives of some of these countries where oil from Africa goes is also very, because they are now more prone to look for clean, cheap, and secure energy. And so any small instability in Africa can easily make the role that it can play in the future a little bit limited. And also, the Africa must keep watch of some of areas in other parts of the world. For example, in the United States, where there's no drilling in the wildlife area in Alaska. Santa Barbara is off the limit for exploration activity. The Eastern Atlantic coast in the United States is off the limit. Suppose these places are open up for exploration and production activity. Africa must be very cognizant of what that would be. And then, of course, the balancing of environmental issues, African countries must keep watch. And then the advances in unconventional technology can even make some of these Asian countries that have become the destination of Nigerian oil or other African countries more competitive if the technology to develop shale in those parts of the world becomes acceptable. Let me quickly then look at the role of OPEC and national companies. And this is, I'm not going to dwell on this,